everyone. I'm Thomas Morton. This is Proof, a pre-election podcast special with Seth Abramson based on Seth's trilogy of books, putting together the pieces of the full Donald Trump story from thousands and thousands of disparate news items and other public reports and records. I tried to take a little break from the elections last weekend and indulge in a guilty pleasure by reading some of Frank Herbert's classic sci-fi saga, Dune. And I say tried because holy crap, does the Trump administration and contemporary politics fit right into the Duneverse. It's like seamless. You have this galaxy being run planet to planet by great noble houses under like a nominal form of space feudalism. But then the whole thing's underpinned by the economics of interplanetary trade and covertly really run by the mysterious CHOAM Corporation in order to maximize shareholder profits and manipulate galactic politics by controlling vital resources and commodities, specifically the geriatric spice melange. So Herbert was originally writing this in the 1960s, and the first couple of books are pretty clearly based on the Middle East back then, with the spice melange as an analogy for oil. CHOAM is like OPEC in space. Most of the language he uses and the cultural stuff derived from Arabic and Bedouin culture. But if you've been listening to this series as we've tried to untangle the wild and Byzantine schemes and crooked financial dealings that surrounded and led to Trump's rise to power, it's exactly like Dune. You've got Saudis and Emiratis holding secret meetings on a yacht to broker peace with Israel in order to isolate Iran and diminish American influence, like they're the Spacing Guild and Tleilaxu face dancers, secretly meeting with their hated rivals, the B'nai Gesserit, to plot the downfall of Paul Atreides. You got Eric Prince and Giuliani running around doing covert, mostly illegal or at least illegal-seeming diplomacy, like they're agents of the Padishah Emperor. Eric Prince is providing Mohammed bin Zayed a private mercenary army for the United Arab Emirates made up of U.S. Army vets, which is almost the exact same thing as the Imperial Sardaukar shock troopers of Salus Secundus. But even just the fact that we no longer discuss countries or governments as the active participants in what's going on, but individual people like Trump, Mohammed bin Zayed, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, Eric Prince, and then all their relatives are involved too, like the Trump children, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, who's actually Eric Prince's sister. It's like the great houses of the Landsraad and all their plans within plans within plans. And unfortunately, the Trump clan doesn't really align with the noble House Atreides so much as, or pretty unmistakably, the villainous House Harkonnen. Geez, Trump's elevator shoes are even just like Baron Harkonnen's fat-hiding suspensor lifts. It's uncanny. Anyways, I could probably go on with this, but we've got days until the election and pressing non-fictional matters to cover. But still, the fact that the best reference point I can find for what's currently happening in American politics and culture is basically the darkest and most politically turbulent sci-fi universe, maybe outside of Warhammer 40K. It really speaks ill to where we've come as a country. Although, as the B'nai Tleilax say, every civilization must contend with an unconscious force which can block, betray, or countermand almost any conscious intention of the collectivity. Let's get back into it with Seth.
Well, I think it underscores how little we as Americans appreciate the scope of Donald Trump's collusion around the world, that he will suddenly and with great interest insert himself in some geopolitical debate that's happening half a world away, and insert himself in a way that is incredibly decisive, but destructive, and at the same time, inexplicable, unless, not to be too self-aggrandizing, but unless you've read a book like Proof of Conspiracy, or unless you've followed the sort of network of major media stories about Trump's collusion in the Middle East, to understand that not only did Donald Trump, in the belief of the feds who investigated this for years, receive a $10 million payment from a bank that was somehow routed through Egypt right before the 2016 election. And to be very clear, that's a stalled federal investigation where they can't get the final piece of evidence. But that is the theory that the feds have, that Egypt actually paid Donald Trump to rescue his ailing campaign in 2016. But also, Thomas, you mentioned in our Red Sea Conspiracy episode that in 2008, 2009, when Donald Trump was plotting at the time, 2012 presidential run with Michael Cohen as his would-be sub rosa campaign manager at the time, not only did he do that 2008 deal with Dmitry Rybolovlev in Florida that he believed was a $54 million deal, $54 million of profit deal that he was, in his own mind, doing with Vladimir Putin.
Right. It was a Russian investment in his future disguised as a wildly overpriced house sale in the middle of the housing crisis, just to emphasize how ridiculous the figures being exchanged were.
Well, exactly. And at a time when he was facing personal bankruptcy and when, of course, the US economy was collapsing, he believes that Putin rescued him. But as you mentioned last time, Thomas, that was also the year that Donald Trump received $9.5 million free and clear in a very strange real estate deal that involved the parents of a business associate of Elliot Broidy. Elliot Broidy, who's now under indictment for bribery-related charges, has been convicted of bribery-related charges in the past. Elliot Broidy's business partner's parents sold a massive mansion for $9.5 million to an Egyptian scam artist by the name of Gerglis, a man who ultimately had to flee the United States because of all his creditors and because he allegedly had been involved in all sorts of scams and had no money whatsoever. But somehow he bought, quote unquote, a property from Elliot Broidy's associates' parents for $9.5 million. And before he fled the country, he gave it to Donald Trump, basically free and clear, later denied he had anything to do with it, despite his signatures being on the documents. So Donald Trump, as he is plotting a 2012 run, gets about $10 million because of the auspices of a shady Egyptian character. And then he gets 10 million, 8 years later when he actually is running for president in 2016. And then, as you just pointed out, a few weeks ago, he suddenly inserts himself in a Nile dam dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia, in which Egypt is considering going to war with Ethiopia over a massive dam that Ethiopia is building to try to rescue its economy, that the Egyptians say violates a prior agreement. And Trump says the Egyptians are going to have to blow up the dam, which leads to a flurry of activity at the diplomatic corps in the U.S. and in Ethiopia because of the fact that the U.S. president is almost implying that there should be a war between Egypt and Ethiopia and that he takes Egypt's side. So that's completely indecipherable to Americans unless you understand that Egypt is part of the Red Sea conspiracy and appears to have helped Donald Trump in two separate elections, one that he didn't actually enter, and then one that he did in 2016. And maybe now he's trying to return the favor, hoping for additional assistance from the Egyptians in the days before the election.
That's a likely, yeah. I didn't think of it as I always think of all these things as, in terms of quid pro quo, that we're already on the quo side of everything, that these are investments playing off via what are either, weird foreign policy like signals, tells, or gaffes or mistaken. Like I'm reminded again of what we were talking about the other week when just a month after MBS of Saudi Arabia announced his Middle East anti-terror coalition that would help get rid of the ISIS caliphate, ISIL, that was right when Trump inexplicably said, I know of a secret plan to fight ISIS. And the way it was treated in the press wasn't that he had just accidentally exposed his knowledge of an ongoing scheme, but just like, oh, this unhinged guy spouts more unhinged lunacies. And I feel like everything I've seen about his Egyptian comment says exactly that there's no overarching context. It's completely divorced from all his relationships with the Middle East at the same time that he's trying to trot out this ongoing, multi-part peace plan with everything. And what's really funny is that there's like in the middle of everything, there's literally a country in the middle of this. Egypt and Ethiopia are not neighbors. Were Egypt to execute a World War II-esque dam busters mission on the Ethiopian dam, the immediate damage via the water released would probably be felt by Sudan, would it not?
Yeah, and it's interesting, given that you say that, Thomas, that Sudan, of course, just enters the news now as well, with a peace deal with Israel, a normalization of relations. And I do have something I want to say about Trump and Sudan, a topic that I'm sure most of our listeners will not have encountered before. The intersection of Donald Trump's foreign policy and Sudan is seemingly very obscure. But the point that I want to make about both the Trump-Egypt and what I'll talk about with Trump and Sudan connections is that it's clear that Donald Trump and his allies in the Middle East, his autocratic allies, particularly in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, so MBS, MBZ, and El-Sisi, they believe that they can collude without it coming back to sting any one of them. Because we know that there was, at least between Trump and Saudi Arabia, Trump and the UAE, and Trump and Israel, so I'll add Netanyahu to this, collusion in 2016, as we talked about last time, and it got revealed in the New York Times, but there was no follow-up whatsoever in U.S. media. When the Mueller report occurred, Mueller didn't investigate that. When the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence issued its 1,000-page bipartisan report, it hardly touched on that issue at all. We have intelligence reports that are being put out by Trump's stooges at the ODNI, suggesting that the only nations interfering right now are Iran, Russia, and China.
ODNI is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, one of those new, vaguely titled cabinet positions the Bush White House created in the aftermath of 9/11 in Iraq.
When we have every reason to believe, and certainly there's every motivation for Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Israel to continue colluding with Donald Trump to help him maintain his political career in the way that they did in 2016, and we hear absolutely nothing about their activities. So when you wonder, what's the value of $10 million to Donald Trump from Egypt, or what's the value of a peace deal he gets to announce with Israel and Sudan, these are courses of collusion and illicit election aid to try to assist Donald Trump's reelection. They're being trotted out right before Election Day. And it's clear to all of the participants that there'll be no consequences in the media. There'll be no congressional investigations. There'll be no federal investigations. So, of course, Donald Trump's going to pick up any scrap of value that he can. Very briefly, in Sudan, what people need to understand is the following. Sudan is on a U.S. terror list, and that substantially restricts our dealings in Sudan. It is incredibly hurtful domestically to Sudan, which obviously is divided into two countries. I think many people know that there's Sudan and South Sudan. But the announcements, the proclamations that the U.S. has had involving Sudan for many years, that it's a sponsor of terror and that puts it on this list, is something that for a long time, the top proponent of removing that designation has been MBS in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would like to be the patron of the Sudanese in the same way that the Saudis have the U.S. themselves as a patron. So in a sense, MBS expanding his power in the Middle East has been trying to find sort of vassal states that he can do a good turn for so that they will be beholden to him. Libya is another example with Sudan. So MBS has been pushing for a long time for that normalization. MBZ in the UAE has been pushing for the normalization of Sudan and U.S. ties with respect to that terror list. Eric Prince, who was a Trump advisor in 2016, and as far as we know is still a Trump advisor, has been pushing for Sudan to be taken off that terror list. And then about a year ago, Netanyahu got involved. And now you have someone who's friends with the Kushners and with the Trumps, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, trying to get that designation removed. And you have MBS supporting not just Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese president before the coup, but even after he's been deposed, you have MBS supporting the military thereafter. So there's a desire in the Middle East among Trump's allies to create a long-term alliance with the Sudanese by getting them off this terror list and so on. And we sort of wondered, what was it all leading to, besides perhaps Eric Prince getting some oil refinery deals in Sudan, which he did, and getting some consultancies in Sudan, which he did, and some trade deals between Saudi Arabia and Sudan and UAE and Sudan. Besides that, well, now we know that what Sudan is getting out of the bargain besides those things is it's going to have to agree to a normalization with Israel, and that's going to be rolled out just before the U.S. election as another alleged piece of evidence that Donald Trump is a peacemaker, should win the Nobel Peace Prize, has a coherent foreign policy, when it does appear that, as in Egypt, the Trump-Sudan deal is just the product of a series of transactions that really were happening between autocrats, including Netanyahu, in the Middle East and the Sudanese, and have nothing to do with U.S. national security, because U.S. national security might suggest that Sudan should stay on that terror list.
I mean, they did play host to Osama bin Laden for how many years? Most of a decade?
Exactly. So it should be, in fact, not a peace deal that gets celebrated with a signing at the White House and that the media covers as a great accomplishment for Donald Trump. We should be asking what transactions behind the scenes between the Red Sea co-conspirators and Donald Trump led to this event. Who was getting rich off it? MBS, Eric Prince. Did Trump or anyone else in his sphere have any sort of personal benefit that they could seek in Sudan? Because it's really hard to locate the national security advantage to the U.S. of this new Sudanese deal.
Right. It strikes me now that rolling it out piecemeal isn't just like good digital marketing strategy, whereas, you just keep it in the news. It also, if you were to announce a peace, it's like we completed this omnibus peace deal between Sudan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel. Is Jordan still in it? I can't remember.
Jordan actually dropped out of the Red Sea conspiracy shortly after it began. Yeah.
But in so doing, you would, definitively link those people. And at least to me, if I were to read that, I would question what they all have to do with each other. And in my mental map, I would plot out where they all sit next to each other and be like, this is, not just a geopolitical kind of like power block being assembled, but it's a geographical block that where Sudan has a massive amount of agricultural land suddenly being tacked on to and is right across the Red Sea from Saudi Arabia, is basically, it's in a separate continent, but it is its neighbor, and has water and fertile land, which is exactly, weirdly enough, when Osama bin Laden was in Sudan, according to most records, he was there. But I mean, he's doing Al-Qaeda, but he also had like an experimental farm kind of going that he thought might take over from the jihad, or might become the jihad, as it were. Anyway.
Well, can I just add to that, Thomas, that we said when we were talking about the Middle East in our last episode, that energy is at the heart of global geopolitics. And that's the case in Sudan as well. There are energy resources that certain people in the Middle East want to have preferential access to, through preferential trade deals with the Sudanese. So one thing that people might not realize, and we don't want to get too deep into what they call peak oil theory, but there is some fear in Saudi Arabia that the oil is eventually going to run out, or I should say, that reliance on non-oil technologies, wind, solar, and so on, could lead to a reduction in demand for oil. And the Saudi economy is, of course, dependent upon that.
In the last 2 decades, the whole advent of fracking, but also other innovations in oil recovery have made Middle Eastern oil a lot less like the only source. I mean, I remember in the early days of peak oil, it was that the best reserves we have are in the Arabian Peninsula, and they're all going to be gone, and we're going to be fucked. But then we started recovering stuff from the tar sands in Alberta and such.
Well, and not to mention the fact that the coming geopolitical, soft war, a sort of somewhere between a Cold War and a hot war, is going to be in the Arctic, where there's incredible amounts of drilling being sought by the Russians and some others. And you have all the nations on Earth that are in the Northern Hemisphere trying to sort of race to get resources out of the Arctic. So Saudi Arabia really has to diversify its alliances, its interests, its access to energy. And Sudan is part of that, as well as there being these really complicated terror ties, because of course, most of the terrorism, or much of the terrorism, I should say, in the 21st century that America has suffered through, including September 11th, had as its base Saudi Arabia, as well as you mentioned, Sudan offered a home for Osama bin Laden for a period of time. So, I mean, we just have to basically say, who is Trump, cutting these deals with, and who is benefiting? If I can mention one other instance in which Erik Prince specifically rears his head, this international warlord who is out only for himself and his own enrichment, and who is one of Donald Trump's, I would say, top 2 or 3 advisors based on the evidence we have when it comes to foreign policy. Let us remember that Erik Prince spent the 2016 general election specifically advocating that the next administration assassinate the number 2 man in Iran, General Qasem Soleimani, and that the MBZ in the United Arab Emirates was pushing for that as well, that Donald Trump actually got on board with assassinating Qasem Soleimani, which every previous U.S. administration had decided not to do because they thought it could lead to a regional war in the Middle East that could actually explode into a larger world war-like conflict. So we always had the ability to kill the number 2 man in Iran, Qasem Soleimani, but we didn't do it for strategic reasons. Suddenly in 2018, when we re-up our defense accord with the UAE, Donald Trump gets on board officially with what MBZ, who is part of the Red Sea conspiracy, and Erik Prince, who is part of the Red Sea conspiracy, have been pushing for years. Benjamin Netanyahu joins the chorus of people demanding that Qasem Soleimani be assassinated in 2019, many, many months before it happened. And so by the time Donald Trump assassinates Soleimani at the very, very beginning of 2020, all of the people pushing him to do it are the Red Sea co-conspirators. All of the people telling him not to do it are intelligence career officials and career officials within our diplomatic corps who are not the political appointees under Mike Pompeo, saying this could be the most dangerous decision a U.S. president has made. And there were major media accounts that described it as the most dangerous decision an American president had made since World War II. Now, why was that decision made? Why did Donald Trump lie and pin certain attacks that happened in Iraq against our soldiers on Iran rather than the terrorist militias that we now know conducted those attacks? Why did he set that up as a sort of prerequisite and laying the groundwork for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani? Well, we now know that he was in constant contact with MBS, MBZ, and Netanyahu in the planning of that assassination. The result of that assassination, let us not forget, was over 200 traumatic brain injuries among US soldiers in Iraq who faced an Iranian rocket attack because of that assassination of the second most beloved man in Iran. And Donald Trump called those over 200 TBIs not injuries at all. Then he conceded that they might be like headaches. Then he said they weren't real injuries. All of that was an attempt to cover for the fact that he had again used US soldiers as losers and suckers in what fundamentally was another part of the quid pro quo with the Red Sea conspiracy. So it's not just Sudan, it's not just Egypt, it's events in Iraq, it's events in Iran that are incredibly dangerous. Let's all remember, we were minutes from going to war with Iran this year in January 2020. And the reason we almost went to war with Iran is because of the Red Sea conspiracy that was struck in 2015.
Oh. And the background of all this and what blows my mind, just Eric Prince's liberty in this world and ability to make money, continuing ability to make money as a mercenary tycoon is already flabbergasting. And then he's associated with a sitting American president, albeit nebulously. But in the lead up to this and to the targeted assassination of Soleimani, Eric Prince is literally running an assassination squad for the United Arab Emirates, like an on-paper organization employing U.S. veterans in addition to other mercenaries to do assassinations, to murder people for another government that our CIA didn't even know about.
Yeah, Eric Prince has been running around really the world recruiting veterans from the U.S. military, from the British military particularly, but also from European and South American militaries to get them involved in, we call it an Emirati hit squad, and we should, because it certainly emanates and was an idea concocted in Dubai and Abu Dhabi in the UAE. But let us remember from the last episode, our Red Sea conspiracy episode, that listeners to this podcast should see MBS and MBZ as joined at the hip. They speak every day. Their countries are closer than any analogy we could use for any two countries in the Western Hemisphere. And so let's not forget that it was a Saudi hit squad, a Saudi assassination squad that assassinated a Washington Post journalist in Turkey, right? When he had gone to the embassy in Istanbul to try to resolving, his marriage, and he didn't come out because a hit squad had been sent from Saudi Arabia, from Riyadh, to strangle him, to murder him, ultimately to dissolve his body in acid and immolate it in a barbecue. It's one of the most grotesque things you could imagine. And this is a U.S. resident who writes for the Washington Post. Donald Trump and Jared Kushner thereafter try to cover for MBS, pretend that he's not involved. We find out later from John Bolton that Jared Kushner and Donald Trump knew of MBS's involvement, even at a time that when they were saying that MBS was not involved. Yes, this is separate from the Emirati hit squad that Eric Prince trained.
Eric Prince's mercenary hit squad for the United Arab Emirates is called Reflex Responses and apparently operated without the CIA's awareness until a reporter for BuzzFeed told them about it.
But you have this power trust of MBS and MBZ who have a vision that is consistent with Eric Prince's vision of what war and what, frankly, politics should look like going forward. In their view, war should be privatized and it should be fought by mercenaries, not the members of a country, but rather by mercenaries hired by the autocrats who run a country. That has even been pitched to Donald Trump by Eric Prince as how the United States should wage war in Afghanistan. So Prince wants us to follow this MBS, MBZ model. And also you have this model for how politics should be conducted, which is basically you assassinate your enemies around the world using these hit squads. Eric Prince wants to help MBZ do that. MBS is already doing that. We already have the Turkish president, Erdogan, sending his goons to beat up protesters in DC. There's an incident discussed in Proof of Corruption that would stun people, where you actually have essentially Turkish forces under the command of Recep Erdogan, with diplomatic immunity in the center of Washington, D.C., beating up D.C. police officers, beating up Secret Service agents, beating up men and women and children who are unarmed in the center of our nation's capital. And Donald Trump does nothing about it because he has Trump Towers Istanbul in Turkey and is essentially an economic vassal of the Turkish president. So this idea of projecting your violence abroad in other countries at your whim and facing no consequences is a creeping international nightmare that Trump is one of the key authors of, as well as Eric Prince.
There's Eric Prince, whose connection to him, just despite not having any sort of official position, he's constantly there. Or, I mean, as a security advisor,
No, what just dawned on me as you were saying that he's always there, Thomas, is that, people associate Eric Prince with two places in particular where he's been most active, the Middle East and Africa, as we already mentioned. But Eric Prince is such an international warlord that there's a whole Trump collusion scandal we haven't even talked about yet and that most Americans don't know about that takes place in South America. In Venezuela. And once again, Eric Prince is at the center of that too. And Giuliani, right? A lot of the people that we've seen. I mean, to be honest, we didn't talk about Eric Prince's involvement in Ukraine. But if you read Proof of Corruption, Eric Prince shows up with Giuliani in the Ukraine scandal. So Eric Prince that's why I say he's clearly one of the top foreign policy advisors to Donald Trump, because he shows up every place Donald Trump wants to illegally collude with other countries for his own election benefit. What happened in Venezuela, very simply, or I'm going to try to simplify it, but it's quite complicated, is that there's a socialist president in Venezuela by the name of Nicolas Maduro. And Maduro, specifically in Venezuela generally, is now a Putin puppet regime, which is enormously lucrative to Russia, to have Venezuela, which is a major oil-producing country, as essentially a puppet regime, particularly because it allows Putin to project himself into the Western Hemisphere, but also it's just incredibly lucrative to the tune of billions of dollars for Russia, which, remember, is not a particularly rich state, as we have talked about. It's a gas station masquerading as a country, according to the late John McCain. So Nicolas Maduro is a Putin ally. The U.S. has issued all sorts of sanctions, and Donald Trump, to be very clear, has issued many rounds of sanctions against Venezuela and Maduro for its repressive political tactics at home. This is a repressive regime being propped up by Vladimir Putin. Now, the problem is, or the number of problems, that those sanctions that we've imposed on Venezuela is illegally finding ways around in order to send its material resources to Russia and the UAE. And many in Congress have tried to push Trump to punish Russia and the UAE for being involved in these sanctions evasion scams and schemes in Venezuela. Donald Trump has refused to do so. So he'll put the sanctions on, but the sanctions are basically meaningless because they're being evaded. They're making the Russians and the Emiratis rich. Those are two Red Sea conspirators. And what does Donald Trump do? He does nothing to enforce U.S. sanctions. But it's even worse than that, because it turns out that even though the U.S. has these many rounds of sanctions on Maduro, secretly, Donald Trump's agents have been working in Venezuela for a year and a half to try to ensure that Maduro is not succeeded, that is, followed in office by Juan Guaido, a reformer who the U.S. officially supports. But Donald Trump's agents in Venezuela, or U.S. agents who have gone to Venezuela, are trying to ensure that there's a deal cut so that Maduro, the Putin puppet, can stay in power in Venezuela. And who is down there in Venezuela engaged in those negotiations that contradict official U.S. policy? Rudy Giuliani, Eric Prince, Lev Parnas, who we know from the Ukraine scandal, major mega donors for Donald Trump from Florida, and an oligarch. I mean, talk about bringing to mind what Giuliani was doing in Ukraine. There's actually a Venezuelan oligarch who is facing federal charges in the United States. Stop me if this sounds familiar, who Rudy Giuliani is representing as part of this scheme to try to keep Maduro in power. Major media that's written about this, and there are major media outlets that have, but it's not as many as should have said that if people knew who Rudy Giuliani was representing in Venezuela, Donald Trump would lose a substantial percentage of the Latino vote, including the Venezuelan American vote, in Florida, in a way that could lead to Joe Biden winning that state. So the fact that the media hasn't reported on Trump-Venezuela collusion between Trump and a Putin puppet Maduro in Venezuela is actually electorally significant to Donald Trump, because it could keep Florida in his corner when some of his Latino support would collapse if this scandal had broken, as I tried to do in Proof of Corruption at great length. But if it had broken wide nationally prior to the election, it would have really hurt Donald Trump. And I think everyone listening to this podcast knows that major media now says that if Donald Trump loses in Florida, the election is probably over for him. So it's incredible that this massive course of collusion in our Western hemisphere that involves Putin and all of the personalities from Trump-Russia and Trump-Ukraine collusion has not been more written about by major media. What a boon, what a gift to Donald Trump that is only being talked about in Proof of Corruption on this podcast and in scattered articles by Reuters and the AP that somehow never turn into a scandal that fully breaks before the 2020 election.
Yeah. I mean, I get how it hasn't, because it isn't, I feel like in comparison to all the other cases of collusion and the conspiracies that we dealt with, there's at least a little more of a straightforward thrust to it, whereas this one completely kind of overturned at least my expectations, and is one of the few cases where Trump specifically, but also his team, is usually very open and transparent about what they're doing, where he actually did try to seemed like he was putting Maduro's feet to the fire, keeping the anti-Maduro tension, where it seemed like he was coming down hard against one of Putin's people, which could have, potentially just on the surface put the lie to the idea that he was, Putin's puppet here in the United States, or that he was completely in his pocket, which initially made me wonder if this was a convenient example that could have been trotted out to say, well, I'm not always, if somebody were to line up everything, which we know they're not going to do, in the media, and say, like, every case, in every foreign policy decision where there's a clear, there could be a clear benefit to Russia or not, you tend to always do the thing that will obviously benefit Russia. Here's one example where what you're saying about the Russians' friends in Venezuela seems to be antagonistic. But in fact...
Well, but honestly, Thomas, that's why what you just described is the same reason that I'm actually so amazed that it hasn't blown up more and that it wasn't a bigger deal. I mean, compare it to the Trump-Ukraine scandal, where Donald Trump worked very hard over a span of years to try to frame Ukraine as a corrupt country, which if he was undermining in a significant way, which of course he was, let us remember that he and Giuliani were working on withholding military aid to Ukraine in 2017 and 2018 and trying to force the predecessor to Vladimir Zelensky to offer Biden dirt, to offer other benefits to Donald Trump in 2018 in exchange for military aid. And we're trying to do this up to the spring of 2019, and trying to do this within the context of Donald Trump telling everyone, this is a corrupt country. So any dealings I have with them where I'm withholding something from them, saying that they need to take care of corruption, I'm being a freedom fighter, I'm being an anti-corruption crusader, when in fact, as we know now, it was just a shakedown to get information, to get money, in exchange for an endorsement of Vladimir Zelensky's opponent prior to the April 2019 election in Ukraine. But then switch over to Venezuela, right? Venezuela is this country where Donald Trump frames the Maduro regime as you pointed out, this great example of how Donald Trump is a freedom fighter and an anti-corruption crusader. And look, Vladimir Putin is friendly with Maduro, and nevertheless, I'm bringing Juan Guaido, Maduro's opponent, to the State of the Union address. So this is going to be, Donald Trump tells voters in the United States, the clear exception that brings down the whole house of cards of Trump-Russia collusion. I am clearly opposing someone who Vladimir Putin supports. The idea that would turn out to be a lie, and that one exception should, in fact, not be an exception at all. Donald Trump is very much working hand in glove behind the scenes with Vladimir Putin. The idea that this one regime that he's actually worked hard to vilify and demonize should be one that behind the scenes he's working with through his agents is very different from how he's handled Ukraine or Israel or Saudi Arabia or the UAE. Usually, if he's secretly doing deals with a country, he tries to build up their leadership as honorable, as vital to the US. Remember, he talked for months and months about the reason why he had to sell all these military weapons to Saudi Arabia, because it creates so many jobs for Americans, and there are great friends in so many ways. And then here you have Venezuela, and he demonizes this guy, and then he's secretly trying to keep him in power. To me, that's almost, more shocking than the sort of more typical build up an autocrat as a hero and then work with him trope that we've seen elsewhere in his foreign policy.
Yeah. Well, and the way he did it. Would you mind, can you give me the timeline real quick of how Giuliani's trips and how his clients kind of unfolded into this?
So what's so complicated for those of us who have seen any interview with Rudy Giuliani over the last few years is to think that he might be deviously conniving. Now, why do I say that? He comes off as such a babbling fool in his interviews, as such an obvious malefactor in his attempt to insinuate Kremlin disinformation into US elections, as such an obvious toady to Donald Trump in so many spheres. We just talked about Venezuela, but also in Ukraine and elsewhere, that it's hard to imagine that, in fact, Rudy is also a very greedy person who is willing to act as an agent of foreign governments on really lucrative security and geopolitical contracts, and to have his own self-interest, much like Donald Trump's, run counter to US national security. Now, I think what we should view Giuliani as is someone who is out for himself, out to get rich, out to make money at whatever cost, willing to sell out US national security to do so, willing to lie publicly to media to do so, but always making sure that his actions redound potentially to the benefit of his patron and, of course, his client, Donald Trump. So I don't know that I'll be able to give a blow-by-blow timeline of his actions here for several reasons. It's incredibly complicated. It's already in the proof series. But even more importantly, the timeline would have Rudy Giuliani creating client relationships in Ukraine, creating client relationships in Russia, creating client relationships in Israel and the UAE and Turkey and Venezuela, and then lobbying on behalf of these interests with his client, Donald Trump, as sort of an intermediary between Donald Trump and the people who want to buy Donald Trump's foreign policy. Those meetings have essentially began prior to the 2016 election. Rudy Giuliani was flying to Turkey to get his marching orders on certain pending federal cases prior to the 2016 election, so that as soon as it was over, when Donald Trump won, Rudy Giuliani was in a position to lobby Donald Trump on the Zareb case, for instance, on the Gulen case, on the Halk Bank case. These are three cases where Recep Erdogan wanted the US government to do very specific things. He wanted a case against the Turkish bank Halk Bank dropped. He wanted Fethullah Gulen, a cleric who lives in Pennsylvania, a very important election state now, to be extradited to Turkey so that Erdogan could have him executed. He wanted Reza Zareb, someone who is being held by the US post-conviction as a felon who helped Iran evade sanctions and do a sanctions evading deal with Turkey. Erdogan wants Zareb to be sent back to Turkey so that he can essentially be lauded as a hero. Zareb also has negative information he could give to federal investigators about Erdogan. So Erdogan wants Zareb back in the country. Rudy Giuliani was lobbying on behalf of Erdogan's interests in all three of these cases. He was lobbying on behalf of a Venezuelan oligarch close to Maduro. He was lobbying on behalf of Dmitry Firtash, the Ukrainian oligarch who had a pending case in Chicago. Essentially, what Rudy Giuliani did, starting in 2016 and in meetings that extended through 2017, 2018, 2019, and even in 2020, is he has found criminals abroad who are either facing pending cases in the United States or want to become benefactors of Donald Trump so that they can gain some domestic benefit of Trump's foreign policy. And he's been the go-between. That's why he's currently under federal investigation for acting as illegally as a foreign agent, for bribery, for fraud. The mere fact that the president's personal attorney appears to be an international criminal who's currently under federal investigation for attempting to buy U.S. foreign policy, just that fact alone should preclude Donald Trump winning on November 3rd. But unfortunately, it's such a confusing timeline. It makes sense if you read it, but it's hard to summarize that you have to read three books in the proof series to get all the meetings that Giuliani's had around the world.
Right. I mean, it should preclude him being any major party's nominee on top of any of that, or just having the support of anybody before that, beyond just sitting in office. And I just wanted to emphasize, that when you say lobbying, he has never registered with the State Department as a lobbyist. Like, this is all being conducted as, geographically coincidental client meetings with the various people under criminal investigation, including money launderers, mostly a lot of other fraud. What are the other? So
money laundering, fraud, acting illegally as a foreign agent, bribery. We're talking about wire fraud here. I think that they will be looking at him.
Yeah. Oh, I meant his clients. Yeah.
His client. Sorry. Well,
there's too many. Yeah, there's too many different crimes to keep track of. Yeah.
Well, his clients, it runs the gamut. In many cases, it's bribery. In some cases, it's running illegal sanctions, evasions schemes. But most of them are, frankly, trying to bribe the U.S. government in some way or bribe some government. But here's the incredible thing, is Rudy Giuliani is not being paid by Donald Trump. He says that Donald Trump, gets all his services for free. Rudy Giuliani won't say who is paying him. There are times when he's been involved in these meetings in Europe where he's trying to arrange collusion between Trump and a foreign autocrat, where he says, I just happened to be there because I was working on another case and I was being paid by another client. So I just happened to be in that particular city.
You know how that works, right?
Right. You know how that works.
He saw me in the bar and was like, hey.
And then sometimes Rudy Giuliani, when he gets caught holding these meetings, will say the most incredible thing of all, which is, I'm representing my client, Donald Trump, President of the United States. So somehow, Rudy Giuliani, this is going to amaze historians. The president's lawyer is saying that when he's illegally acting as a foreign agent on behalf of foreign countries trying to bribe Donald Trump, he's actually working on behalf of Donald Trump, which is as good as conceding that you are the middleman in a bribery scheme, where autocrats around the world are trying to bribe your client, and you're going to represent your client to make sure that that bribe goes through. But let's also be clear, just so that too much heat doesn't come down on Rudy Giuliani, without us equally suggesting that Donald Trump knows exactly what his attorney is doing in all of these countries. The men talk every single day, according to Lev Parnas, sometimes multiple times a day. Rudy Giuliani is not engaging in these courses of conduct without knowing that he has the ear of the president on a daily basis. In fact, in Proof of Corruption, I established that White House aides were so concerned that Rudy Giuliani was illegally lobbying Donald Trump every time they were alone in the White House, every time they were alone on Air Force One, every time they were alone at a dinner, that they had to say to Rudy Giuliani, you need to stop lobbying your client on behalf of foreign governments. And of course, that lobbying never actually stopped, because let's remember that Donald Trump was seeking to benefit from all these relationships Rudy Giuliani had. One of my favorite facts from Proof of Corruption is that you have, as one of the longest chapters in that book, the story of Trump-Turkey collusion, which is harrowing, leads to war crimes, genocide, U.S. soldiers being fired upon by a U.S. ally, Russian soldiers taking over U.S. airfields in Syria, the collapse of the U.S. presence in the Middle East, the resurgence of ISIS. The Trump-Turkey collusion story is probably the worst Trump collusion story there is. And it's preceded by Donald Trump saying during the 2015-2016 general election, I have a conflict of interest in Turkey. He told everyone that if he were in a position to try to make policy for Turkey, he would have a conflict of interest because of Trump Towers Istanbul, which brings in somewhere between millions and tens of millions of dollars to him annually. He's attempted to obscure how much he makes from it. He has other ventures in Turkey that make him millions of dollars. Recep Erdogan has made Donald Trump's business partner, Mehmet Yasindag, and his son-in-law essentially the chief Turkish emissaries to the United States on trade and basically everything else. So Erdogan said, look, this is Trump's business partner. I'm going to make my emissary to Donald Trump's business partner, at a time when Trump has said he has a conflict of interest. And further, let me add that Erdogan, during the 2015-2016 general election, when he heard that Donald Trump was considering a Muslim ban, publicly threatened to cut off Donald Trump's business deals in Turkey all at once, all together, costing Trump tens of millions of dollars if Trump pushed forward on this Muslim ban. And Donald Trump thereafter reversed course. So let's be very clear, reversed course as to Turkey. I should be very clear on that.
It just granted them an exception, right?
Exactly. So Erdogan learned very early on that he could control U.S. foreign policy through the conflict of interest that Donald Trump had that should have precluded him from being the GOP nominee for president, that should have required him to divest himself of Trump Towers Istanbul, all his Turkish ventures, and frankly, all his ventures internationally. And I mean full divestment, not just saying my kids are running it and I promise I won't talk to them about it, as who would possibly believe that pablum? I mean, that's just nonsense.
My kids, who, by the way, I'm sending on directly diplomatic missions occasionally and just tapping for whatever I feel like, and who are a constant presence, not only in the White House, but who basically, have a very clear position in our administration that I'm simply never going to name.
Yeah, Ivanka and Jared have positions in the White House and have been part of the sort of negotiations that have Trump Organization business implications, simultaneously with them acting as White House agents who are supposed to be advancing U.S. foreign policy and national security. Donald Trump Jr., who says he's not part of the Trump campaign in 2016 and 2020, in fact, was acting as part of the campaign. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. So let's understand that Donald Trump goes into the presidency really disqualified from being president because he's already said, I can't set Turkey policy without a conflict of interest, and I'm not going to divest my interests. And Erdogan has already shown that he controls my foreign policy.
Within the first month of the presidency.
And what ends up happening? Erdogan starts sending Donald Trump's business partner and or his son-in-law to the U.S. on a regular basis to meet with Trump, to meet with Kushner. Erdogan has privileged access to Donald Trump in terms of phone conversations in which John Bolton, this is one of my favorite moments in The Room Where It Happened, John Bolton's book, he describes a conversation between Erdogan and Trump on the phone, with Erdogan shouting so loud at Trump like he's a subordinate throughout the entire conversation that it's almost like, according to Bolton, Recep Erdogan is standing on the Resolute desk, pointing down at Donald Trump, shouting at him what he must do. And in that case, it involved withdrawing from Syria, which Trump does. So all those consequences that I went through, and I won't go through them again, of us withdrawing from Syria and Trump-Turkey collusion, the genocide, the war crimes, and so on, we knew that that was going to happen before Trump was elected, and the Republicans didn't stop it, and the intelligence community didn't do anything, and Trump's sequence of national security advisors didn't do anything, possibly because the first one, Michael Flynn, was secretly working as an agent of Turkey, we later found out, and plotting to kidnap Fethullah Gulen from Pittsburgh so that he could be sent to Turkey and executed by Erdogan. It beggars belief, and I know it will sound crazy to people, but like I always say, everything on this podcast comes from major media reporting.
Yep, and the footnotes are all available. You can go read every single little tidbit of information, every little morsel that was offered up via reporting, which, not to I know I shut on the media constantly, but it's hard. It's hard to get a lot of these tidbits and to get parts of the story right. But to the end of the service you do and the job you do of assembling everything and actually keeping all the details straight as a forest and not just trees.
Well, and we did try to make everything we could as public as possible. So people should understand when we're talking about the endnotes that there are thousands of. We're talking about the endnotes for Proof of Collusion, the 2018 book, Proof of Conspiracy, the 2019 book, and Proof of Corruption, my book that was just published in 2020. The endnotes for Proof of Conspiracy and Proof of Corruption are all available online. And that's a total of something like 9,000 or 10,000 endnotes that are available online for free. Not just because I want people to know where the information comes from, but as you're indicating, Thomas, I want to celebrate the great investigative journalism that led to this information getting into the public. The fact that it died on the vine, that it wasn't picked up by other outlets, that it didn't go wide in America's consciousness prior to the 2020 election isn't really down to the reporters who compiled the information. It's down to our media ecosystem. It's down to us being distracted. It's down to me not being as successful maybe as I would have liked in getting the proof books out there. They were all national bestsellers, and I'm hugely appreciative of that. But look, there's stories in there that I know that I and these thousands of reporters wanted millions of Americans to hear prior to the 2020 election. And that unfortunately didn't happen. But it's no discredit whatsoever to these great reporters.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure how you'll like the comparison I'm about to draw, but I always thought one of the greatest things that ever happened in terms of the Mueller investigation, one of the greatest things that ever happened to Trump was that it came out as a book. That it is an enormous amount of text you have to not just read, which is already a burden, for a high barrier of entry for a lot of people, but read, keep in mind, and understand. Although what really blows me away when you brought up Flynn and his offer of help to bring the Turkish pro-Kurdish cleric that Turkey wanted to bring from America back to Turkey to kill because they were mad at. He did so through I believe, an Israeli-backed security outfit, although the problem is, and so here's the exact problem I've got. I'm trying to remember which of the 5 Middle Eastern security companies Michael Flynn has worked for who do dubious things is the one that was involved in that attempted kidnapping, or the offer of an attempted kidnapping, just to be fair. Special Spear Operations Group, or was it... Because it's none of these people have just done one bad thing. It's Rudy Giuliani is not just I'll created a weird back channel, conversation via his supposedly external legal client wielding his client attorney privilege as if it's some sort of Die Hard 2 style diplomatic immunity that's just ultimate invincibility versus an actual following actual rule of law. It's they just keep doing horrible things. They all have so many crimes and they all work for so many, there's the connections aren't just standalone. I don't know what to make of it. It's just you think doing one evil thing would be enough for one person in a while, but I guess after you get used to it, I guess that's the deal with major crimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, let me say a few things about that, Thomas. So the Mueller report, to its credit, when it was released as a book, became a #1 national bestseller. The problem is, even when that happens, unless you're Mary Trump or Bob Woodward, and the book stays as a top bestseller for months, you're still talking about hundreds of thousands rather than millions or tens of millions of Americans reading that text. And I frankly think, as you're intimating, a lot of people may have bought the Mueller report and still not read it. I do think we need to mention, regarding the kidnapping plot that Michael Flynn was allegedly a part of, that one of the people who was at least at one of the planning meetings was a top Trump advisor who was a former intelligence official who was so troubled by what Michael Flynn and Erdogan's agents in America were plotting with respect to this Turkish cleric in Pittsburgh, or the Pittsburgh area, that this former top U.S. intelligence official, who was a Trump campaign advisor, went to Joe Biden in the fall of 2016 to report that Michael Flynn was involved in this. So when Barack Obama meets with Donald Trump for the first time after the 2016 election, he tells him 2 major things. Number 1, he says North Korea is going to be the biggest foreign policy challenge for you going forward. He might have said Russia if he hadn't seen the problem with trying to tell Donald Trump Russia was an issue. So he says North Korea is going to be your #1 problem. The second thing he tells Donald Trump is, don't hire Michael Flynn under any circumstances. And that's because Donald Trump's own presidential campaign had dropped a dime on Michael Flynn in the pre-election period in 2016. And it was Donald Trump's presidential campaign from within so worried about Michael Flynn that it activated the very highest levels of the Obama administration to try to warn Donald Trump not to get in bed with Michael Flynn. And of course, when Donald Trump ignores that advice and hires Michael Flynn anyway, you can understand why anyone in the Obama administration would think, what is going on with Donald Trump, that he brought in Flynn when specifically told this man's a threat to U.S. national security. And when, frankly, the dime dropping was coming from inside the House. It was Trump's own campaign that was worried about Michael Flynn. But let me make a final point. We talk about books and how many people can be reached by books. We talk about how all these tangled associations Michael Flynn has are so confusing that it can be easy for Americans to say, I just don't understand this. I'm going to ignore it because I'm too confused. What I worry about, Thomas, is that even when there's a really simple story, it somehow is not permeating through major media. And let me give you an example, and it's pretty quick. It's Trump-China collusion. You say, how could that be a quick story? Well, we already had an episode on it, so I'm not going to rehash that part. But what about what we just learned within the last week? That not only does Donald Trump have a secret bank account in China, but when he was caught with a secret bank account in China, he lied at a presidential debate watched by 63 million Americans and said that the account had been closed in 2015. Days later, it was revealed that he had lied and that he still has an open, active, mysterious bank account in China. Remember, in the context of some other very simple facts, which is that he started his push for Trump hotels into China right after he announced his presidential run in 2015. And the fact that he has sought lucrative trademarks by the scores, him and Ivanka, in China, and that they have been granted to him right around the time he's making policy decisions as president that benefit the Chinese. Those are really simple facts. Every American should understand that Donald Trump is somehow, that we don't fully understand yet, in the pocket of the Chinese. And yet every article I read is about Hunter Biden's deals in China, which are never associated with any misconduct whatsoever. So that's a simple story, Thomas. How do you account for Americans not latching on to the fact that Donald Trump's greatest, most dire collusion is with the country he says, falsely, unleashed willingly a plague upon the world that has killed 250,000 Americans? How come that hasn't saturated, even though it's on TV, it's not in a book? Well, it is in Proof of Corruption, but it's also on TV. And even though it's pretty simple.
Right. And he rents part of the Trump Tower to one of China's major banks and then lied about the fact that they were moving out. Yeah.
Right. And their lease is coming up. Right. And so he's negotiating with a Chinese government entity a lease deal that could mean millions or tens of millions of dollars to him. Again, all of this was avoidable. Let's be really clear. It's not illegal. It's not impeachable for a business person to run for president. That is just fine. Obviously, we have evidence that Donald Trump's entire business career has been a series of crimes. But put that aside. Let's say he was an above-board businessman. That's fine. Run for president. But the moment you win, I would argue the moment you start setting policy during the campaign. But all right, the moment you win, divest yourself of everything you have. You'll make money in the divestment, but you won't be in charge of that divestment process because it could take years, but you won't be in part of the divestment process. You'll know that you're just going to see some amount of income from the divestment of your assets, but that you're never going to be able to control those assets again. And you escape all of these conversations about China and about Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Israel and Egypt and just all these places around the world, Ireland, the UK, where you have interest. And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it because he placed his greed to make money off the presidency over U.S. national security. And every day he confirms that his own personal interests rank much higher in his thinking and in his emotions and in his plotting than the life of one American or 1 million Americans. How are we even having a conversation about this man being reelected? It's almost unthinkable. And it really, I don't say that as a partisan. I have never seen another politician of either party so clearly put their own personal interests above U.S. national security. Say what you will about Mitt Romney or John McCain or George W. Bush, there was always an argument that while they maybe had a different geopolitical philosophy, and there was certainly with Bush an argument that there was systematic lying to the American people, but you always had a sense, I'm putting Dick Cheney aside for a moment, but just focusing on the presidents, you always had a sense that they cared about U.S. national security. I'm looking for any evidence that Donald Trump cares about U.S. national security. And here we are talking about the possibility that this could be a close election. It's incredible.
No, it isn't. It is incredible. I keep trying to create just an image system in my head where I'm like, if somebody else who wasn't It's the idea of like, it's like, oh, we should have a businessman run the country, which I don't have an argument with, except that outside of Donald Trump's, the deals that you've been able to establish direct evidence towards him doing for his own personal benefit or the benefit of his company, or the benefit of somebody who paid him at some point, to whom he's in debt, doesn't run the country at all. And I keep thinking of like, if we, the great Republican bugaboo of the last 10 years, like, oh, we don't need to elect another lawyer. But it's as if we had like elected a lawyer who was still a practicing trial attorney while, like, instead of running the country, who would go to court, represent himself as the president of the United States, but like before a court, like there's no other, and I guess because businessman is such like just a nondescript sort of job, there's nowhere else where that would be in any way acceptable. But somehow the fact that it's business, that our national religion is enterprise, has maybe at least prepared the way for this. But it'd be one thing if he was a businessman. He's not. He's a con artist. Like he's just not even a businessman.
Well, and this is why, Thomas, one of the most upsetting things that I hear on my Twitter feed, and have occasionally, with some regularity actually, heard since 2017, is something that I hear from folks on the left, where they say, well, if Donald Trump is impeached, this is what they were saying prior to the impeachment that we had the trial in January 2020. If Donald Trump is impeached, who really cares? Because Mike Pence becomes president, and that's just as bad. Or we have to find a way to get rid of both Donald Trump and Mike Pence, some Democratic partisans will say to me. I get really upset by that because it suggests that you actually don't understand anything about the Trump presidency. You just want to see someone in office who has a D next to their name rather than an R. I don't think I agree with Mike Pence on a single policy prescription that he has for America. I also think he's a dishonest person who, for a variety of reasons, I don't have personal respect for, aside from the policy differences. But Mike Pence does not have an international ring of collusive courses of conduct and compromised business transactions masquerading as a foreign policy in the way that Donald Trump does. Mike Pence is not a clear and present danger to U.S. national security. So if you are listening to this podcast or you're considering voting and you don't understand the unique threat that Donald Trump specifically, and yes, the people who are in his milieu as agents, Mike Pence is actually not part of that inner circle. If you don't understand the threat that they pose to national security and global security, you really haven't been paying attention. If you think we're still just talking about partisan policies and what's Mike Pence's view on abortion, yes, we can have that debate, but let's first make sure the country is made safe. And the country is only made safe when this one individual is no longer in power because he's been voted out on November 3rd.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's because I've seen that kind of commentary too. Oh my God. Well, actually Pence would be worse. And it's an inflated contrarian sort of touting of people's like political insiderism, which at this point, I feel like has gone so far into the realm of just seeming like, I remember Hunter S. Thompson wrote a thing in Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72 about getting way into Beltway politics, where the actual effects of them, the actual, use of government and who it affects the most, usually like the least of our society, falls by the wayside for people who get really obsessed in the same way that gamblers, when they get into higher level gambling, have less and less interest in who's winning the game than what happens in the game and being able to predict things. They want to cover the spread, right? And that politics, and he's writing this in 1972, so that's before, bad with math, 50 years ago, half a century ago, that playing the game, like not thinking of the government as just this arena, essentially, for a game of intrigue and discursive wars that has no effect on anybody's actual life except the one that you want to kind of like drum up to kind of frighten people, is just, and then just becomes social currency for folks. Oh, Pence would be way worse than Trump. Well, tell me more about that. Please explain to me how you have smartly figured out how, despite everything else that, first makes sense and then has been established and read, would suggest the opposite. By all means, allow us your hot take, as it were, in the argot of our times.
Well, the one thing I will say, though, Thomas, just so I don't give a misimpression of the content of Proof of Corruption, there is a chapter in Proof of Corruption entitled Pence.
Right. No. Oh, no, he is a bad guy. Yeah.
Well, no, but let me say this. The reason that chapter exists is that Mike Pence is used as an agent by Donald Trump in his Trump-Ukraine collusion. We can see that as a corruption of Mike Pence that Mike Pence willingly walked into that led to him lying to the American people, frankly, in the same way he probably lied about Michael Flynn in January and February of 2017. But, we see that corrupting influence of Donald Trump on a wide variety of people throughout government. And I don't give those people a pass. I don't give Mike Pence a pass. But it's clear that the originator of the poison is Donald Trump. I would argue working in cahoots with Eric Prince, Rudy Giuliani, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump Jr., who are really part of the deranged brain trust that has been running American foreign and frankly, domestic policy, if you add Stephen Miller, over the last few years. Anyone who has been corrupted in that way certainly has lost their place in America's trust and should lose their place permanently in American government. But it emanates from one individual, and that individual is Donald Trump.
It's just like the Kwisatz Haderach Paul Atreides said, a leader is what distinguishes a mob from a people by maintaining the level of individuals. Too few individuals and a people revert to a mob. That's it for this penultimate episode of Proof with Seth Abramson. Please join us again for the 10th and final installment, or final for now. You never know these days.